Once a year, Halloween comes along. Horror and panic are expected. At the end of the day, it is all fantasy and most of us look back on it with fond memories. However, sometimes the horror and panic comes to life in the form of legitimate serial killings, torture, and death. With that, here are 5 of the most gruesome murders that took place on Halloween. The Halloween Killer. In 1973, 9-year-old Lisa Ann French left her home in Wisconsin to trick-or-treat by herself. Dressed as a homeless person, Lisa walked around the neighborhood. Her original plan had been to trick-or-treat with her friend Ann Parker. Unfortunately, Ann had been grounded and wasn't able to leave her house, leaving Lisa to explore the neighborhood by herself. Soon, Lisa would stop by a classmate's house and then the house of her teacher, Karen Bauknicht. After this, she headed toward the residence of a man named Gerald Miles Turner Jr. Lisa was familiar with Gerald, visiting him and his family often. And so, when she arrived to the house with the door wide open, she walked right in. Gerald began discussing things such as candy with Lisa before eventually luring her to the bedroom. It was there that he removed her clothing and SA'd her. During the attack, the trauma would cause the girl to die of circulatory shock. Sometime later, Gerald's girlfriend Arlene would arrive home to pick him up. The two of them were supposed to go to her mother's house. Gerald, at this point, would claim that he wasn't feeling well and that she should go alone. She eventually did. Had she walked into her bedroom, she would have discovered the corpse of the young 4th grader. Back at Lisa's home, her mother, Marianne Gehrig, grew worried that her daughter had not returned home. By 10 p.m., the authorities had been contacted and a search party was formed. Unknown to her, Lisa's body had been stuffed into a trash bag and was currently en route to Taycheedah, Wisconsin. It was here that Gerald would dump the girl's body in the fields of a farm. 4 days later, the farmer that owned the property would discover the bags behind a barbed wire fence near a forest. Gerald was immediately a suspect. He was arrested after months of questioning and eventually convicted in 1975. The Lisk Family Massacre. On October 31st of 2010, 16-year-old Devin Griffin returned home from a church concert. After playing some video games, he went to go check on his mother and stepfather, Susan and William Lisk. It was there he found what he thought to be a silly Halloween prank. However, the pools of blood on the ground and the multiple gunshot wounds were a little too real. Soon he realized they were. In a panic, Devin called his aunt, who contacted the police. Once the police got there, they discovered a 3rd body, Devin's older brother Derek. Someone had used what was suspected to be a hammer to send deadly blows to the 23-year-old's cranium. This murder weapon was different from the gun used to kill Susan and William. It was thought that Derek had been killed first with the hammer so his parents wouldn't be alerted. Once police spoke with Devin and confirmed his story, he was cleared as a suspect. They then turned their sights on Devin's stepbrother, William Lisk Jr., also known as BJ. Before I continue, I'd like to pause and give you an opportunity to help me continue making videos by purchasing my novel, The Junkyard Kids. In the novel, our protagonist witnesses a serial killer brutally murder his parents at a young age. This event causes him to become homeless in a city filled with drugs, crime, and corrupt police officials. Along with this, he must protect his younger brother, and together, they team up with 3 other unwanted outcasts, eventually seeking shelter in a deserted junkyard. Unfortunately, their semblance of peace doesn't last long. One night, 2 thugs enter the junkyard, causing our protagonist to witness yet another murder. In a turn of events, he gets involved, killing the murderer in self-defense. Knowing no one will believe their story, he and his friends dump the bodies in a river. Fearing they'll be caught, the group makes plans to flee the city. However, as they attempt to do so, they come across clues to the identity of the murderer who killed the main character's parents. Deciding he wants justice more than freedom, our protagonist drops his plans of escape and tracks down the serial killer. However, the serial killer may track him down first. As Amazon reader Laura D says, "Scary twisted, a real nail biter. Sad, and probably more like some people's struggles to stay afloat in a cruel world." If this sounds good, click the thumbnail at the end of this video. It'll bring you to a sample reading narrated by me. Either that, or click the link in the description below for the Amazon page where you can purchase the book. Right now, the ebook version is only 99 cents. This may go up in the future, so purchase as soon as you can. One last thing, if you buy the book and enjoy it, be sure to leave a positive review on Amazon. I may use your review in one of my videos. And now, back to the story. While investigating BJ, it was found that in 2004, he was charged with assault on Susan. Further investigation found that the two argued often, which would usually result in physical altercations. At one point, BJ attacked his stepmother while she was in the shower, and he was even suspected of torturing the neighborhood cats and dogs. His violent outbursts, combative behavior, and constant alcohol consumption resulted in him being kicked out of the house. Despite this, William Lisk Sr. still attempted to reach out to his son. That's why a week before Halloween, he took a vacation from work, going deer hunting with his troubled 24-year-old. The father and son returned to the Ohio residence on October 30th. BJ still wasn't allowed to stay over, but on this night, his father had been drinking and was in no shape to drive. This would ultimately cost the lives of him and his family. At approximately 6:30 a.m. the next morning, William Lisk Jr. went to the room of Derek, repeatedly bashing him in the skull with a claw hammer. Derek died within a few moments of the first strike. After BJ was sure Derek was dead, he crept to the room of his father and stepmother. With his father curled up in the fetal position, BJ walked toward him until he was close enough. Once he was, he raised the gun. At point blank range, he pulled the trigger again and again, sending 5 bullets through the head of William Lisk Sr. This surely woke his stepmother, who he then turned his attention to. He shot her to death as well. Around 3 hours later, Devin came home to change his shirt. He ran into BJ, who seemed happier than normal. Devin soon left for church and would discover the grisly scene hours later. It is unknown why BJ did not murder him as well. BJ Lisk would be caught at a hunting cabin less than an hour after the bodies were discovered. He would later receive 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole, but would take his own life in 2015. The murder of Sister Daya Benz. On October 31st, 1981 in Amarillo, Texas, a nun went to the room of 76-year-old Sister Daya Benz. The door was closed, which was unusual since the elderly nun always kept it open even when she slept. Upon entering the room, the younger nun was left in shock. Sister Daya Benz was on the ground naked, dead, and with blood covering her face. The body was taken to a funeral home. Not long after, the nuns called the police after finding a broken window on the first floor of their convent. It was found the murderer had entered by cutting through the screen. A white t-shirt was found near the bed along with a knife. A second blade was discovered in the driveway. During the autopsy, it was found the deceased nun had suffered contusions to the head, abrasions to the back of her neck, as well as vicious stab wounds to her chest. Despite these injuries, it had been determined that her cause of death was strangulation. She'd also been SA'd. Once police began their investigation, a similar knife to the one found in the driveway was found in the home of a 17-year-old named Johnny Garrett. A witness also stated they saw him running from the convent on the night of the murder. His fingerprints were also found in the convent. During trial, Garrett denied murdering Sister Daya Benz, stating that he had simply been in the convent days prior looking for items to steal. Unfortunately for him, the court didn't believe his story and he was sentenced to death. However, months prior to Sister Daya Benz's death, another elderly woman named Narnie Bryson was also murdered. Narnie's murder was almost identical to Sister Daya Benz's. She'd been beaten, strangled, and SA'd just as Sister Daya Benz had. The killer had also entered the residence through a cut screen and left his white shirt beside the bed. Despite what you may think, Garrett wasn't responsible for the murder of Narnie. A man named Leoncio Rueda would eventually be found guilty for this case. To many, it was obvious Leoncio was also responsible for the murder of the nun. In a sad turn of events, it was later discovered Garrett had a horrific upbringing which included being SA'd by his stepfather. During his childhood, he was forced to star in pornographic movies with grown men, given drugs, and at one point, forced to sit on the burner of a stove, resulting in severe scarring. A mental health professional would describe Garrett as one of the most virulent histories of abuse and neglect he had ever encountered in 28 years of practice. And after all that, he would be falsely accused of murder. Garrett was put to death in 1992, maintaining his innocence even during his lethal injection. To this day, he has never officially had his name cleared. The Toolbox Killers. Starting on September 27, 1979, serial killers Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris began their killing spree. In that same year, the duo traveled through Southern California, kidnapping, torturing, and murdering 5 teenage girls. According to an FBI agent, Lawrence was the most disturbed individual he had ever investigated. In June of 1979, both men began picking up female hitchhikers simply to develop a strategy for luring women into their vehicle. By the end of the month, they'd commit their first murder. Their spree would end on October 31st of that same year. A 16-year-old girl by the name of Shirley Ledford stood outside a gas station on that night. She'd been hitchhiking home from a Halloween party in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, she'd never returned home. Sometime during that night, she accepted a ride from Lawrence and Roy, recognizing Lawrence as a frequent customer of the restaurant she worked at. She was offered marijuana by one of them, but refused. After this, Lawrence and Roy drove the girl to a dark, secluded street, gagging her and binding her limbs with construction tape. Roy pulled out a sharp blade. The two killers drove around in the dark aimlessly. Soon, they removed the construction tape from her mouth and legs. At first, they simply slapped and mocked the girl. This soon escalated to them screaming and beating her with their fists. Eventually, Shirley cried. Lawrence ordered her to cry louder before striking her with a hammer and beating her in the chest with his fists. Pliers were used to twist and tear her genitals and breasts. Shirley begged and pleaded for the abuse to stop. It would not. She was then SA'd. The pain and agony would only escalate from here. Taking a hammer from a toolbox, Roy brought the metal down on Shirley's elbow. He did so again, and again, and again. In the end, that hammer would be slammed against her flesh and bone a total of 25 times. Lawrence pulled the car over and went to the back of the van with Roy. Taking a coat hanger, he wrapped it around Shirley's neck. He used the pliers to twist it as tightly as possible, watching her face turn blue and the life drain from her eyes. Once they were satisfied, the two dumped the body on the front lawn of a random stranger. The next morning, it was found by a jogger who reported it to police. This murder on Halloween night would be their final kill before they were caught. Lawrence was sentenced to death while Roy was given life in prison. The Candyman. On Halloween night of 1974, 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien came home from trick-or-treating with his sister, father, and 2 of the neighborhood children. After consuming some of his candy, Timothy complained that one candy in particular tasted bitter. His father gave him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash it down. Unfortunately, the trick-or-treater began vomiting and convulsing. Soon his body went limp. Less than an hour later, he was dead. Later during Timothy's autopsy, it was found that one of his candies, a pixie stick, had been laced with potassium cyanide. There was enough poison in the candy to kill 2 fully grown adults. This event sparked a panic in the neighborhood, with parents either throwing away their children's candy or handing it over to the authorities. While no other children had died, it seemed there was a monster lurking in their community. The panic further increased when it was realized the same pixie stick Timothy had consumed was given out to 4 other children. Timothy's father came forward, stating that he had received them from a house in the neighborhood and then subsequently given them out to the children in his group. The parents of these children frantically searched their kids' bedrooms, hoping to find the sugary death sticks. Luckily, none of the other children had consumed the poison. These pixie sticks were analyzed and they were found to have even more potassium cyanide than the first, enough to kill 3 to 4 fully grown adults. Authorities asked Timothy's father Ronald to take them to the house where he received the pixie sticks. He couldn't remember where it was. Understandable. It was nighttime and there were many houses they went to, only there were not. The group had only visited 2 streets before returning home due to rain. Not only this, but none of the houses on those streets had given out pixie sticks. After some time, Ronald located the house for police. He stated he never actually saw the man who gave him the candy because the owner didn't have the lights on. The house's owner was named Courtney Melvin. Mr. Melvin worked at an airport and over 200 people stated he had been working that night. Furthermore, Ronald was approximately $100,000 in debt and had recently taken out life insurance policies on both his children months earlier. He took out a second life insurance policy on them only days before Timothy's death. The nail in the coffin was when police discovered Ronald had gone to a chemical supply store to inquire about purchasing potassium cyanide. In the minds of police and the public, this confirmed what they already suspected. Timothy O'Brien had been murdered by his own father so he could cash out on the life insurance policy. Ronald was arrested a few days later on November 5th, 1974, although he maintained his innocence. He would be eventually found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. In prison, even his fellow death row inmates despised and hated him all the way up to his execution on March 31st, 1984. Thank you for watching my video. YouTube tends to suppress these types of videos, so if you want more content like this, make sure you subscribe. Also, if you're interested in the novel I mentioned earlier, click the thumbnail on screen now for a sample reading. That's all I have for now. See you next time.